Welcome to the Academy of Ideas Economy Forum. I'm Rob Lyons, I'm the convener of the forum, and I'll be chairing this discussion on the impact of coronavirus on Italy and South Africa. In their different ways, Italy and South Africa are very important economically. Italy is the eighth largest in the world by nominal GDP and the third largest in the EU. It has a highly developed manufacturing sector, on a par in many respects with Germany's, and still runs a trade surplus. On the other hand, GDP growth has been practically non-existent for years, and persistent economic problems have left Italy as the country most likely to bring down the Eurozone. South Africa is the second largest economy in Africa and the only African country in the G20. It has rich mineral and resource wealth, but it is also stagnating, beset by a one-party state and corruption. Where once it was branded as an up-and-coming economy, one of the BRICS alongside Brazil, Russia, India and China, it is no longer talked about as being a major part of the future of the world economy. Moreover, both countries have been badly hit by the crisis. Our speakers are Dominic Standish and Russell Grinker. Dominic is a lecturer, media commentator and on Italian affairs, and author of Venice in Environmental Peril, Myth and Reality. Russell is a former architect who's worked in the housing and economic development sectors in the UK and South Africa for more than 40 years. The discussion will be a game of two halves. Dominic will introduce his thoughts on Italy, followed by about 30 minutes of discussion, and then we'll turn to Russell for his thoughts on South Africa. Right, so over to you, Dominic.
Okay, ciao from the first lockdown country in Europe, now largely unlocked, which is enjoyable but also important economically. Given this is an economic forum, I'm going to give you quite a lot of data. It's very kind of data driven. So bear with me if I need to look down at my notes to check the figures briefly. I'm also going to share some charts with you. I've got three headline messages for this introduction. The first one is that the COVID crisis has not turned into a financial crisis in the short term. It's largely been averted by Italy increasing its budget deficit and its debt. And the European Central Bank has been the key institution in supporting Italian debt expansion. Second key message is that there has been a historical and contemporary weak political leadership in Italy. That has made the debt problems and other economic problems worse. My third key message is that despite all these problems, Italy has many positives. Yet the current government is not sufficiently focused on the key issues and is too focused on various different mechanisms in Europe for saving Italy. So let's get into what's happened with the lockdown in Italy. So non-essential companies were closed between the 23rd of March and the 4th of May. Approximately 4 million employees not working. Then on the 18th of May, all shops could open, and on the 1st of June, bars, restaurants, barbers and beauty parlours could open. In terms of what happened to employees during the lockdown period, Italy was actually quite lucky because it already had a furlough scheme called Casa di Integrazione, literally integration into the house, which has been operating for many years. Under that scheme, contracted employees at home get 80% of their official pay. However, the experience of that varied quite considerably. Thousands of Italians received no money. I was speaking to an employee at a large jewelry company last weekend. He told me he was initially told by his company that he had to go on vacation leave at the beginning of lockdown. And then when he did receive his check from Casa di Integrazione, it was only 30% of his regular salary. In terms of the length of the furlough scheme, it's usually 6 months. However, just on Monday, La Repubblica newspaper reported that the government is planning to extend that to the end of the year. For the self-employed, they were officially given a measly check of €600 per month. That's for the lower paid self-employed. Again, a lot of people didn't receive that. The biggest losers in lockdown were clearly people working in the informal sector, and the Financial Times estimates that a fifth of the Italian economy is in the informal sector. There was definitely an increase in people receiving poverty payouts. So Caritas, the Catholic charity, reported that during lockdown, it gave assistance to new poor people for the first time coming for assistance. There were 450,000 people getting handouts from Caritas, and 61% of those were Italian. Nevertheless, not everybody suffered to the same extent, and average savings in Italy and indeed across the Eurozone actually increased during the lockdown period. Nevertheless, the financial daily Il Sole 24 Ore reported on the 29th of June that a third of Italians are relying on savings which will run out by the end of August. So that will cause problems for them. In terms of assistance to companies, most companies received loans, not grants, with the exception of Alitalia. It's like a big black hole that keeps getting money thrown into it and is in the process of being nationalised. However, it was also reported that only a fifth of the money applied for through banks actually got to companies. This was at the end of May. So many companies have not received those loans. Istat, the Italian Statistical Bureau, has reported that a half of all firms, which represents 37.8% of employment, will see a lack of liquidity for expenditure until the end of 2020. So the question is, will those companies be able to survive? In terms of what happens in the second quarter, it's not quite clear yet what the figures will be for economic decline. But in the first quarter, GDP declined by 5.3%, and that's after the economy only grew by 0.1% in the fourth quarter of 2019. In terms of what will happen the rest of the year, it's very difficult to forecast, but the IMF and the Bank of Italy foresee a fall in GDP of up to around 13%. In terms of how the government has responded, it has made pledges of 180 billion euros, but of course pledges are not the same as spending. The government has increased its budget deficit. So the budget deficit in 2019 was minus 1.6%. That is now forecast to rise to nearly 12% by the end of 2020. There has also been an increase in government debt. So in April, government debt went up by 36 billion euros and is now forecast to reach 157% of GDP. That's compared with 135% at the end of 2019. So debt is a real key problem in Italy. And as I mentioned earlier, the European Central Bank has been supporting Italy by buying bonds, which lowers the interest rate on the debt. So March to April, the ECB bought close to 40 billion euros of Italian debt. At the beginning of June, the ECB increased its emergency bond purchases by 600 billion euros. And indeed, it bought all of the new debt that was issued by Italy in April to May, which was 51 billion euros. Indeed, the ECB ditched its own rules on proportionality in debt purchases in its pandemic emergency purchase program. It overbought Italian debt and underbought German debt and severely underbought French debt. On Monday, at the ECB board, one board member, Isabel Schnabel, did a speech saying that those deviations from the rules were necessary to prevent the fragmentation of the Eurozone. So it seems that the ECB has gone from the last Euro crisis and Mario Draghi, the president of the ECB, saying he would do whatever it takes. Now it seems that the ECB will do whatever it takes for as long as it takes. And the pandemic emergency purchase program has been extended to June 2021. And it should be noted it is also not subject to the scrutiny of the German Constitutional Court, which only complained about the regular purchase. Now, while Italian public debt is a very big problem, debt problem is not entirely what it seems, because I'm referring there only to public and government debt. Household debt in Italy is much lower than it is in many European countries, including Germany, Spain, France, the UK. It's a third of what Denmark's household debt is. This is a percentage of net disposable income. So I can just pull up a quick chart on this. And share screen here. So if we look at the overall household debt there, Italy is in red. You can see some of the other countries I mentioned highlighted there.
I'm not getting that, Dominic. I'm not getting the shared screen for some reason.
Getting it now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can see Italian household debt far lower than many other countries, and some of those other countries I mentioned are highlighted. Also, if we look at general private sector debt as a percentage of GDP, which includes household debt, but also company and institutional debt, Italy has less private sector debt than Spain, the UK, Belgium, Sweden, the Netherlands, Ireland, and half the private sector debt of Luxembourg at the end of 2018. Overall, Italian private sector debt to GDP has risen over the last 25 years, but it's actually fallen since 2011. Now, when we're talking about Italian public government debt, the problem is very historical. Indeed, I would argue that a lot of the debt that is being paid now and the interest on that debt is what I would call legacy debt. So in 1994 already, the public debt was 121.8% of GDP, and that's in a period when interest rates were much higher, close to zero now. And indeed, that public debt doubled in the decade to 1994. So if we look at the roots of the public debt problem that Italy is still paying for, that goes very much back to the 1980s and the government led by Bettino Craxi of the Socialist Party between 1983 and 1987, when the debt rose significantly. Now, his party collapsed. He was proven to be corrupt, but then basically all the other political parties collapsed in the corruption scandals of the early 1990s, the Tangentopoli scandals. Silvio Berlusconi's government and Forza Italia were the beneficiaries of that and came to government in 1994 to 1995, but there were still many problems of high debt and rising wages. And this was a key period of change because the Christian and centre-left establishment in Italy reacted with horror to the government collapse, also to fighting the mafia war in Sicily. And basically, Romano Prodi's PPI and the centre-left governments of 1996 to 2001 gave up on political leadership in Italy and pushed Italy towards joining the euro. Obviously, there was a pull factor as well, but this was a key shift in rule in Italy. So what happened as a consequence, Italy joined the euro at the beginning of 2002. That was also the time that China came into the World Trade Organization just in December 2001. So it was like a double whammy for the Italian economy. On the one hand, Italy found it increasingly difficult to compete with manufactured goods from China. On the other hand, entering the euro meant also it was subject to the Stability and Growth Pact, which limited the extent to which Italy could stimulate its budget and boost growth. Indeed, if we exclude interest rates, Italy has run budget surpluses since 1992, except for the crisis year of 2019. So it just hasn't been able to invest. In fact, if we look at investment over 2 decades in gross fixed capital formation, that has been flat. There has also been very weak investment in research and development. As a percentage of GDP, since the year 2000, investment in research and development has been between 1% and 1.39%. If we look at productivity over the last 20 years, that has also been flat in terms of GDP per hour worked, measured by the OECD. So we've seen now 2 decades of very low growth in Italy, and by the period before the COVID crisis, 2019, at the end of 2019, GDP had still not returned to the level it was before the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. So how has the Italian government responded to this situation? Now, I would argue that the end of the Stability and Growth Pact, which has limited Italy's ability to boost growth and invest over the last 2 decades, that has now ended in the COVID crisis, as has the rules on state aid to businesses. I would argue that both of those things are an opportunity for the current government to invest and stimulate the economy. So the government actually called a big 9-day think-in on the Italian recovery, which started on the 12th of June. Invited to that were all the government departments, employers, trade unions, and the opposition parties. They came up with many ideas. Some of those were quite positive, like improving digitalization, investing in education, investing in infrastructure and transport. But the agenda there was also skewed towards the new Green Deal. And that's not really surprising, because an introduction to that meeting was given by the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. And her speech gave the usual platitudes about a new Green Deal and the importance of Italy following the EU agenda. Also attending that meeting, the General Estates, was the President of the ECB, Christine Lagarde, and representatives of the IMF. So it's not really surprising that the Italian orientation seems to be very much to be responding to the COVID crisis in ways in which the EU would expect. And indeed, given that this government was largely moulded by EU intervention, it's not surprising that its policy orientation is skewed towards the European Union. So it seems now that the details of that 9-day thinking will be published in September. And it seems very much that the Italian government is waiting on various European mechanisms to save Italy. The first one is the European budget, and the recovery funds in that budget will be debated on the 17th and 18th of July again. But it's far from certain that that budget will be agreed, and anyway would only start from the 1st of January next year. The other mechanism around which there's expectation is the European Stability Mechanism, but Italy has not yet applied for that, and there are a lot of political tension within the government about whether to apply. That has a lot of stigma attached to it. That might come into play more in the autumn as problems mount. But the Prime Minister Conte has said that at the moment, the priority is to rely on the European Recovery Fund, the new EU budget. However, relying on that spending and making its current pledges, one commentator in Politico last week made the comment that it seems like the Italian government is drunk on EU recovery fund spending promises. So I think that's a good point on which to reflect.
Right, okay, there was a lot in that, and possibly a few surprises for most people who have a stereotype of what the Italian economy is like as well. So if you've got any thoughts or questions, I mean, I just wanted to, while people are considering what they want to say, I just want to ask Dominic, could you just explain who is running Italy at the moment? Because I know from the, we kind of get lost because, I mean, I suppose it's because of the proportional representation and the rise of the league and five-star and whatever. Who is making up the government at the moment?
Well, the principal parties in the government are the Democratic Party, which is seen as a left-leaning party, and the Five-Star Movement, which is kind of seen as left-leaning populist, and Italy Values of Matteo Renzi, which is a very small and more insignificant player. So those are the principal parties. However, as I've written in many articles that have been published, many of the key personnel in the Italian government were not representative of the party system. So the Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, has never run for office. He's not a politician. Many of the key ministers in the administration, including the economy minister, are not people who stood for election. So many of the key personnel have been agreed in coalition discussions twice informing the kind of current government. It was reformed last year, and many of those discussions have involved key personnel from the European Union, including Christine Lagarde, who's commented especially on economy ministers, and former presidents of the European Commission, but other key personnel too.
Oh, great. First hands up. So if you do want to speak, let me just remind you, if you press on the participants button and then use raise hand so I can see that you'd like to speak. So Daniel Ben-Ami, the floor is yours. I'm going to have to ask you to unmute yourself. Great.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, a couple of questions which in a way follow on from the question that Rob asked. Because, I mean, I don't follow Italy closely at all, but when I do look at it, it really does strike me how technocratic the leadership is, as you've just alluded to as well. And to me, that raises two questions. First of all, if they have the vision to get Italy, the Italian economy off the ground, because as I'm sure you'd accept, spending money is not enough. You know, you have to have some kind of vision to restructure the economy, raise productivity, and does the current leadership have that at all? And the technocratic outlook also seems to me to make it very positive towards the EU, again, as you've alluded to. So is there any chance of distancing itself from the EU? I mean, I know that nominally you have the Five-Star Movement and you have the League, and they're quite critical, but it seems to me when it comes down to it, Italy still very much goes along with the whole technocratic outlook.
Great. Okay, I'll take another couple and then I'll come back to you, Dominic. So Giovanna, if you could unmute yourself, that would be great.
Right. Okay. Sorry, I'm still learning. Okay. So, well, I live in the UK, but I have a family in Italy. So sometimes I go there and I try to stay a bit up to date. I mean, I couldn't follow all of you because there was a technical problem, so I had to get out. But what I understood though, that you seem to agree with the dominant economists who say that Italy has not been growing since the financial crisis, has gone backward. and that there has been really a deepening of economic decline. And there is absolutely no doubt that this crisis, this COVID, has worsened the situation. So when I talk to my relatives and people that I know, they keep saying, well, you know, we're just waiting to see if the EU really help us. You know, will they really give us this money? Will they really kind of change their attitude to us? So my question to you was, what would you say to these people in terms of this budget and grants that the EU is now proposing? Do you think that could really help sort out some of the problems, and what is the attitude of the right now in terms of this debate?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Useful questions there. Phil Mullen, again, Phil, can you unmute yourself?
Sure. Hi, thanks very much, Dominic. It was very interesting and very helpful. I thought you explained very well the sort of two-edged or double-edged characteristic of the relationship between Italy as a nation and the European Union, both the way you described that day-to-day sort of material dependence and at the moment sort of appeal to the European Union or hope that the European Union is going to continue to come through, whether it's through the ECB or through the recovery plan. And the other side of that, the way that has sort of stunted the development of a sort of a national economic plan. That sort of dependence has also taken the pressure off in some ways. So I thought you explained that very well. So arising from that, a couple of questions. One is at a national level, Italy, I think, it remains the only G7 country which took the rather bold decision of signing up to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which, you know, strategically was quite a sort of a break from the West. Is there any element within that which is a strategic economic driver of potentially seeing China as an alternative sort of economic partner? Did that play within the discussions which took place? And then turning to the other side, from the national to the regional side, Dominic, you've always, or frequently in your articles, you've stressed the importance or the peculiar importance of regionalism within Italian politics. And given what you've described and what Daniel also referred to in terms of the not only the weakness of the national political class, but also the aloofness and the undemocratic, as you said, the unelected nature of it, is there any opportunity within the regional identities within Italy for the scope for looking at regional sort of economic plans, regional economic transformation plans, or whatever? I mean, I appreciate there's a danger within that in terms of aggravating the north-south divide and so on, but you know, could there be something positive within that in terms of not waiting for Europe, not waiting for China, not waiting for Rome to provide economic answers, but for people locally to begin to take some responsibility? Is there any indication of that? And perhaps it's completely unrelated, but just a factual question. We knew about the sardines movement, which was only a few months ago, really, which was putting quite a lot of pressure on Liga. Has anything come out of that? Is that a sort of a grassroots movement, or is it just a flash in the pan?
Great. Okay. Sorry, I could not unmute myself. Right, Dominic, do you want to come back on those? There's a fair amount on the table there.
There's an awful lot on the table there. I'm going to start with Giovanna's questions. Yes, undoubtedly, Italy has gone backwards in terms of growth over the last couple of decades. In terms of your relatives and their questions about will Europe help us, it's a difficult question, and there's one reason why in my introduction I focused a lot on what has happened rather than what hasn't happened, because the principal focus, as I mentioned, of the idea that Europe will come to the assistance of Italy is the multinational framework in the next EU budget, which, as I said, is being discussed on the 17th of July. The difficulty is there's a lot of disagreement about the quantities and the distribution of grants and loans in that budget. In addition, it's not all what it seems. So the budget as it's currently being presented proposes grants to Italy of 81 billion euros and a slightly more level of loans, which is 90 billion euros. Of course, loans would add to the debt, so that's not all good. So although Italy will receive more than any other country if that's agreed, and there's frantic diplomacy going on every day before that conference in an attempt to get that agreed. Even if it is agreed, firstly, Italy is the third largest contributor to the EU budget. So would actually be paying towards some of that money that's coming to Italy. One economist I read said that those grants and loans over 4 years would be a net gain to Italy of 17 to 23 billion euros per year, which is not a very big amount in relation to the amounts I said earlier. So there are lots of problems in terms of whether that will even be agreed. But even if it is, it wouldn't start until the 1st of January. So that's too late for all those companies which don't have enough money to get to the end of the year. Now, the second area of discussion is the European Stability Mechanism, which there's a lot of hesitation about, because once you're into that, you kind of get the reputation of being a failed state, as Greece was when it went through a similar experience. That proposes 2% of GDP being released, and that being tied to healthcare spending. At the moment, the Democratic Party and Italy Values in the government are in favour of that. The Five Star Movement is against it, as are many of the more right-wing opposition parties like the League and the Brothers of Italy. So at the moment, the Prime Minister Conte, in fact, he made a statement today saying that we are focusing on the next EU budget and the recovery fund, not the European stability mechanism. But I think, although there is not a majority in the Senate at the moment in favour of the European stability mechanism, that might change in the autumn if things get worse, which is quite likely. So coming on to Phil's question, and I'm going to come back to Daniel's because it's kind of a bigger question. On the question about China and the Belt and Road, China does have a lot of investment in Italy, and there are very close economic ties. A lot of Chinese people living in Italy as well. But I think it was more about Italy hedging its bets. I mean, it might be the case that if the EU really lets down Italy, that Italy could move towards China. But I think at the moment, that's very difficult to imagine. In fact, I was just thinking at the States General thinking on the economy, while there were representatives from the EU and the IMF and the ECB there, it would be unimaginable to have some representatives of senior and leading Chinese institutions at any kind of meeting like that at the moment. So in the short term, I can't see it, but if things fall apart with the EU, that might happen. On Phil's question about regionalism, there is actually quite an interesting tension going on at the moment, because many of the regions have told the central government that they've run out of money, especially those that have spent a lot on healthcare, because healthcare is decentralized in Italy. Actually yesterday, Conte, the Prime Minister, indicated there was going to be an additional 20 billion euros put into the budget, and some of that would be distributed to the regions. So there is a real tension rising there between the regions and the central government. However, your question was more about regional identities. I mean, inevitably the coronavirus has exaggerated the regional tensions. I don't see a big move towards regionalism in the short term, unless maybe those economic tensions exaggerate. On your question about the sardine movement, I mean, that was a movement based around people cramming into public squares in cities and protesting, a kind of left-orientated movement. So obviously COVID killed that, because you couldn't have public protests and there's a kind of lack of social distancing. So it was pretty kind of flimsy anyway, singing songs and no real kind of leadership behind it. So I'm not surprised that that seems to have fallen aside at the moment. So finally, coming on to Daniel's questions. I mean, there are some elements in the current government which I think have some vision, and particularly ideas around improving infrastructure. They really want to speed up justice, introduce a lot of new digital technologies. But there are other proposals which I think are really strange, like particularly recruiting a new layer of bureaucracy. And many of these ideas haven't been fully thrashed out. One of the ideas is to build the bridge between the mainland and Sicily, which could be quite a desirable project, although there's already been €1 billion spent on that and not one stone laid, which is largely the fault of the Berlusconi government. So I think that the key problem, as you mentioned in your comments, Daniel, is the orientation towards kind of pleasing the EU agenda and things like the Green Deal, and not kind of sufficiently moving beyond that. And I think, sectors, the Italian economy, responding in different ways to this. Obviously, tourism is a very big question, because 15% of GDP is dependent on tourism and 13% of employment. So this summer is going to be really crucial. And the opening up of Italy seems to have improved things, although the numbers are still quite down and have come especially late for German tourists for their early summer holidays in Italy. But I think more widely, some of the key exporting companies, which is a real strength, especially in northern Italy, could do with a lot more support. I think also some of the digital services could really be expanded and developed. Needless to say, some of the heavy industry, some of the steel plants, which are very heavily indebted, what I think Phil might refer to as zombie companies, continuing to support those, I think, is a mistake. So there needs to be a bit more vision there. In terms of your final question, Daniel, about whether there could be a distancing from the EU, people have probably heard there has been quite a big increase in distrust in European institutions during the COVID crisis in Italy, especially around the initial responses to kind of health equipment and things like that. So discontent with EU institutions has risen quite significantly over the last few months. However, I would say that discontent is very different from distancing and leaving. And there are some fledgling movements that are calling for Italy to leave the Euro and the EU, but particularly the League has not taken that up. That might change because the League's popularity is going down, and the League's leader, Matteo Salvini, is also facing the challenge of the Veneto governor, Luca Zaia. So maybe that might push Salvini towards a more anti-European agenda. I somehow doubt it, although he is a complete opportunist. When I think about your question and distancing from the EU, I think actually the kind of British model is quite useful to think about. Because if you think about the original Brexit vote, which expressed very strong distrust and rejection of EU institutions, that didn't immediately translate into a positive force for leaving the EU until the December 2019 election, when there was a government that could muster the support to actually push through the formal leaving of the European Union. So it's obviously a very big step to go from increasing distrust to actually people trusting an alternative. And it seems to me that most Italians still distrust their own political system more than Europe.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions for you to quickly throw in. One was on the origins of the virus, which we discovered that in fact there was lots of slightly furtive Chinese manufacturing going on in northern Italy, and obviously there's a lot of finger pointing at the fact that many of these workers were coming from Wuhan, and that's how the virus got to Italy. How much of a discussion was that at the time, and also just how important is Chinese ownership of companies in Italy at the moment? Is it still pretty small, or is that a growing trend? And also, it's a much broader question, probably difficult to answer, but to what extent is not having its own currency a barrier for Italy getting out of things? So in the discussion in the UK, it's very much about printing money or quantitative easing going on. Because British government can issue debt in sterling and as much as it wants, or it can get the Bank of England to sort of create money out of thin air to a degree. To what extent is that the fact that Italy can't do that an object of public discussion and in terms of the Eurozone? So I'll put those onto the table now. So right, Paul Reeves, if you'd like to unmute yourself and make your points.
I'm assuming you can. There's two buttons to press there. As Dominic knows, I go to Italy quite a lot, but I've not, for obvious reasons, been recently, so I'm a bit behind it. But thinking back about when I visit Italy, some of the sort of trends and topics for discussion maybe a year or two ago was around things like population, like the fact that Italy's got it's got almost zero growth rate, I think, in terms of population. And kind of related to that, it's got has had, and probably still even more, got very high youth unemployment. So I just wondered if the population factor fits in any shape or form to what particularly can go on in Italy. The other thing that I always think of Italy is, yes, it has got a surprisingly well-developed and large industrial sector. It's particularly strong on machine tools. It's got a large shipbuilding industry, although that is quite an old industry. And I think at one point there was talk about France taking it over. So I suppose my point there is that, to me, Italy seems it's not atomized or fragmented, but it's heavily built on lots of small to medium-sized type industries. I can't think of many large-scale concerns that Italy kind of has. It obviously has Fiat, etc., around automotive, but that's quite a larger, it's quite an old sort of sector. So I'm just wondering, I guess, connecting those things together, I wonder how the productivity problem can actually be addressed in Italy, given that kind of fragmentation. And the original question I was going to ask very briefly was around, and it's been addressed partly, there's always been this tension between the north and south, and I just wondered if there's any signs of, probably going too far to say Italy's going to split down the middle, etc., or something like that, but is that still, is that significant, I guess? Is the north-south significant politically? That's
okay, it. Great. Okay. Jenny Cunningham? You might have to unmute yourself again, Jenny. Hello.
I think I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
I think my question follows on actually from Paul's comments and question. You made the point that Italy's had, sorry, Dominic, you've made the point that Italy's had a sort of really chronic low growth problem. particularly exacerbated by the Stability and Growth Pact. And then went on to say that that pact had actually been suspended, and that in itself you saw as perhaps a good thing, obviously. But I'm wondering, are there any growth areas? Are there any potential growth areas that can actually overcome this lack of the lack of productivity, low productivity? And does Italy have any aspirations in terms of research and development, through universities or through particular companies? Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. And finally, Para.
Okay, you can hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
Dominic, you mentioned that Italy has got and from what I've read, I think it's quite large, an informal economy. I just wondered whether you could say a little bit about how they coped during the crisis, given that anything that the state has given people would all have to be documented, workers, if you like. I did read somewhere that it's given a new surge of activity, if you like, given the mafia a bit of activity because informal people can't get any aid. How true is that? Very quickly, the second one is in tourism. As you say, Italy depends a high percentage of its income on tourism, and tourism definitely fell by about 95% in March, as you would expect. And I know that Sicily, for instance, is apparently doing quite a lot to lure people back. So is that a major debate in the sense within Italy, how they can encourage foreigners and their own people to travel more?
Okay, great. So I'm just going to take James Woodhouse and then I'm going to give Dominic the chance to come back in. Dominic, you're going to have to sort of pick and choose your things you want to take up because we're sort of limited on time. So, James.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, I just picking up a little bit on Paul's sort of approach. There is fiat. I wondered how performance was in particular sectors for which Italy used to be renowned. There's cars, there's fridges with Indesit, there's apparel of all sorts with all the fashion brands and so on. As colleagues have mentioned, machine tools, Italy's surprisingly strong on them and did a lot of business with Russia in machine tools. So the broad question of mechanization, Dominic, would be useful to hear. There's a special thing about Italy, which is its historical relationship with North Africa and oil supplies. And that was what a lot of the post-war energy policy was all about. Now succeeded, as Dominic knows very well, he's written about it, by silly solar panels subsidies, just what the mafia likes. So I wondered if you could comment about energy, because Italy's relationship with Africa has often been depended on that. Where Italy has fallen down is in R&D and also in IT. It used to have Olivetti in hardware, and Telecom Italia was pretty good years ago, but that's all collapsed. Is it still good in any aspects of telecoms? And finally, in Italy, like France, there's a question of agriculture. How backward is it? How interested is the government in fixing that? Or is it, contrary to my impression, unimportant now?
Great. Okay, I'm going to take Sabina, but you'll have to be very, very quick. If you could be, please. Yeah, hi.
Yeah, okay. It's just a question because I've read Ashoka Modi's book, and he seems to think that the new fault line of the EU does run straight through Italy, and he also seems to think that whatever it takes, as long as it takes, it's going to have to end sometime, not least because of Germany. and the possibility of Italy defaulting, the state defaulting. So I found that your introduction very, very interesting. But one of the points Modi makes is that Italy also has a massive problem with its banking sector. So it has a completely over-dimensioned banking sector. There have been several scandal banks, and he says as long as that problem isn't solved, Italy's problems won't be solved. So I just wondered what you said about that. What you had to say about that.
Thank you, Sabina. That was a bit Blair Witch, but very good, interesting questions. Right, Dominic, I'm going to have to limit you to about 3 minutes. So, like I said, pick and choose your topics. Sorry, I've unmuted. Yes.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so true on the banking sector. There's a big banking takeover going on today, and the government has bailed out lots of banks, but it's true that the banking sector is very over bloated. If you have shares in Italian banks, sell them. In terms of James's points, difficult to comment on all those sectors, but on your point about mechanisation, one thing that was a result particularly of Matteo Renzi's government and the flexible labour laws that he introduced, he reduced the fixed term contracts of many workers and the permanent contracts and made basically labour cheaper, which was a disincentive for employers to invest in labour saving devices and raise productivity. So just a quick point there on mechanisation. Coming down to some of Rob's points, yes, there are a lot of Chinese ownership of Italian companies. Haven't really got time to get into that. Yes, there are a lot of Chinese people living in Lombardy, although no proof that they were the source of the coronavirus there in an absolute sense. There was more concern about 2 Chinese tourists who were identified with the coronavirus at the start of the pandemic. The currency problem is an issue because, of course, Italy cannot do what it traditionally did to boost exports, which is devalue the lira. So that's why there are some of the fledgling movements are against the euro rather than the EU. On to Paul's points around population. The data isn't out on this yet, kind of post-COVID, but I think there will be some quite interesting population shifts. Firstly, because obviously lots of young people who were working abroad have moved back to Italy. And tragically, many elderly people have died in the COVID crisis. Now, 1/5 of the adult population were pensioners before the COVID crisis hit. So that is going to change the dynamics around population. But a key priority should be better education and training for the young to reduce the unemployment problems and people leaving. On Jenny's points about more positive areas of growth, this actually ties into some points that James, Para and Paul raised. I mean, it is true that Italy is very strong in industrial production. In fact, before COVID, it had the 2nd highest share of industrial production across the EU after Germany. It's very strong in pharmaceuticals. It's very strong in medical equipment, as people mention, machine tools. And actually, if you look at it, Italy has been a net exporter of goods and services as a percentage of GDP for many, many years. And so really that's the area that the government should be focusing on, is how to boost those exports further and to improve the stronger areas of the economy. I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dominic. That was a very, very useful discussion and certainly enlightening for me, I'm sure for many other people as well. Right, with a sharp turn, we now go to all the way to South Africa. I'll hand over to Russell to introduce his thoughts on South Africa. Can you unmute yourself, Russell? Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, brilliant. Sorry, Zoom doesn't seem to be letting me unmute people for them anyway. So anyway, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. Hello, everybody from Rhodes Village, Eastern Cape, South Africa. There is still something named after Cecil Rhodes in the world, believe it or not. Very, very cold here. I'm at the foot of the mountains, but I'll leave that now. I just need to try and share my PowerPoint. I'm doing the unpardonable and using PowerPoint for this presentation, so you'll have to bear with me 1 second. Okay, here we go. Okay, can people see that?
It's just coming up now. Yes, yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, I think I just have to do a full screen. Okay, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. This is a photograph that I've used for the opening slide of social distancing in a supermarket parking lot. So we do some social distancing in South Africa, although not very effectively. I'll start off by saying that the coronavirus has exposed the disastrous state of the South African economy, its overdependence on mineral exports, and that's been pretty well wiped out by the lack of international demand in the current situation. No doubt there's some people in the audience who are better informed on minerals than I am, but we can discuss that in the discussion phase afterwards. Secondly, government's half-hearted intervention measures in the COVID-19 period have pretty much been too little, too late. This is a picture of people queuing for food parcels somewhere just outside Johannesburg. It's been a pretty desperate situation. And a particularly harsh and oppressive lockdown, and we've had more than 100 days of lockdown now, have not done what they were cracked up to do, which was to give the health system enough time to prepare for the pandemic. But they've done huge economic damage by virtually closing down the economy. Most key sectors have been pretty much shut down. We've had a pretty brutal state already before lockdown. I mean, South African police kill more than 3 times the number of people per capita than police in the United States. If you look back to 2017, 2018, the deaths in custody and by police action were absolutely horrific. Lockdown has accentuated those tendencies. In the first couple of weeks, at least 12 people were murdered by the police and the army, which was brought onto the streets. And even the middle class have started waking up to the horrible situation of state violence against the masses. Just trying to get rid of, I can't read my own slides actually, but the public health system, serious problem. It was already before the coronavirus outbreak not coping with TB, HIV, malnutrition. About 1/3 of kids in South Africa suffer from stunting, which shows the extent of the malnutrition problem. As I said, lockdown was meant to buy time, but the public health system was overwhelmed already, even before the peak in the coronavirus, which is only happening now. So beds are already full, not enough medical staff, many are infected, unable to work, unions refusing to work in many cases, ICU bed capacity grossly insufficient, only about 3,300 beds, the huge backlog in testing, very limited contact tracing and testing, and workplace precautions are very uneven. And they're now anticipating about 48,000 deaths by November, although our statistics are fairly dodgy as well, unfortunately. And then there's the other side of it, which I think has happened in many countries, but because of concentration on the virus, other health measures have fallen by the wayside, particularly things like tuberculosis, which is a major problem in South Africa. HIV regular treatment is not happening. Vaccinations of kids are not happening. And that's going to create a longer-term health burden for the country. So a likely rise in mortality as a result of decline in treatment for AIDS, TB, and other illnesses. A rise in children suffering from malnutrition. Where I live, you can actually, it's quite visible on the street. And some research forecasts have said that the lockdown will cause a loss of life at least 30 times of what the coronavirus may cause. So pretty counterproductive. Okay, the economy. Key planks of state policy, just to summarize. Government was supposed to provide funds to pay wages, but you could argue it was too little too late and very difficult to access. Support to business through tax deferments and loans, but there's been a poor uptake, mainly because it's been very bureaucratic and difficult for businesses to access. And interestingly, all these support programs to the economy have had a heavily ideological bent. So, I mean, the best known ones are obviously banning of alcohol sales, banning of tobacco sales. Tobacco sales are still banned at this point, although the president has just announced, I think, that they're going to bring an end to that. But other peculiar things like you couldn't buy shoes with open toes in the shops, et cetera, et cetera. There was like highly irrational forms of industrial policy measures that they were attempting to implement through the coronavirus measures. So we haven't implemented industrial policy adequately ever, but come the coronavirus, the minister of Trade and Industry tries to start implementing industrial policy through the back door via coronavirus measures. And a key problem is very limited government capacity to implement the programs that it's promised to implement. To business, there's a 200 billion rand credit guarantee scheme. Bear in mind, a rand is about 1/20th of a pound. Loans to businesses with decreased turnover was supposed to be disbursed via the big banks at low rates with certain conditionalities, but the uptake has been very low. There was a 3-week at least delay in implementation, so wages were cut, workers were retrenched from their jobs. There was a 230 million, which isn't very much, relief fund for the tourism sector. It's particularly important where we are, but virtually nobody managed to get hold of any money in tourism relief. And there was a stipulation that only black-owned businesses could get that money. And of course, very few tourism businesses are owned by black people. So in the end, only 2% of applicants for the tourism funds were successful. Ridiculous figures. Then we have the informal economy. Government likes to go on about how much it does for the informal economy in South Africa, which is a pretty big thing because many people cannot make a living except through scratching it through the informal sector, so-called spaza shops. So they were supposed to support these informal traders through bulk buying opportunities, through credit facilities, through business skills support training. They weren't able to give support training support in the best of times, so how they thought they would do it now is beyond me. But they also then tried to formalize the informal sector by saying, if you want our support, you have to formalize your tax situation and your unemployment insurance situation. So obviously, most informal outfits haven't been able or willing to do that. So the very slow uptake. By the end of April, so like after about a month, only 88 of 130,000 traders who applied had actually got anything, virtually nothing, in other words. So many, if not most, small traders were forced out of business to join the ranks of the unemployed. And one of the more obscene parts of it was the exclusion of foreign-owned shops on a pretty much openly xenophobic basis. Foreigners who are the most successful in the informal sector were excluded from any support, but were prohibited really from operating as well. There were all these horrible scenes of informal traders being dragged away by the police for trying to sell in the street and make a living. Agriculture, the Agriculture Support Fund, 1.2 billion rand, but only for smallholder and communal farmers really. And of the 55,000 or so applications, only about 27% had been approved to date, because government was obsessive about saying women and youth should be the beneficiaries. The dominant commercial sector, which is a pretty big employer, although not a huge contributor to GDP, got absolutely no support whatsoever. Mainly, I suppose, again, because those are mostly traditionally white farmers. Maybe not nice people, but they're an important part of the economy. And then we come to the workers. 40 billion rand wage support was promised. Special temporary employee relief scheme, 3,500 per month for 3 months. But it proved very difficult for the employers to access that, as usual. A lot of bureaucracy, backlogs in payouts, uneven implementation, and the system, which is electronic, periodically collapses. So by the 19th of June, only 8% of applicants had been paid out. You can imagine what this means for workers in the formal economy, getting nothing basically, or the employers, if they're able to, having to rely totally on their own resources. So employment has collapsed, and the normal unemployment insurance fund, which has been a long-standing thing, has been unable to cope with vastly increased numbers of applicants, of people who've been put out of work. And then we come to social assistance for those people who don't have any formal employment. This is a picture of people queuing for food parcels outside Johannesburg. All these nightmarish scenes of people queuing. Obviously, social distancing is not a thing. Social assistance, obviously they promised increased social grants to ensure that low-income South Africans survived the shutdown. A special social relief of distress grant was supposed to benefit 10 to 15 million unemployed people who didn't have any other income for 6 months. And child support grant, which is a very important thing in South Africa. It's a kind of hidden form of social benefit. People survive off the grant that's given for their children, was increased by 300 rand a month, and then 500 rand per caregiver. And government showed really bad faith on this, because originally it was assumed for each child you would get that increase, but it turned out no, only the caregiver would get that extra grant. So even that was very stingily applied. And it took about 6 weeks before any grants were paid. Only by the 18th of June, fairly recently, only 1.2 million out of 6.2 million applications, which is less than 20%, had been paid out. And implementation's been appalling. Inefficiencies of the Social Security Agency, and stringent qualifying criteria being demanded of people before they could get anything. So as a consequence of that, it's estimated about 2 million more people have fallen below the food poverty line, which is another real shocker. Okay, so just to sum up the so-called government stimulus package. Before COVID-19 hit, Finance Minister Tito Mboweni announced a pretty stringent austerity budget, and that budget has essentially remained intact. I mean, the main concern beforehand was that government employees were going to be hit by this. The government said they were not going to stick to old arrangements with the unions to pay inflation-linked increases. The reality is the new COVID-19 package has a very limited impact on the budget. Government is not forking out much more than it was originally going to as a consequence of COVID-19. Above the line measures, in other words, spending that has an impact on levels of debt, are limited to 160 billion. 130 billion of this will be financed by a reprioritization of spending within the envelope of the austerity budget. So they're not really forking out much more money than they were originally intending to fork out. So the essential continuation of government's austerity budget will mean 130 billion is cut from provincial and local grants for social infrastructure, including housing, water, transport, on top of 100 billion cuts that were announced in February. 230 billion is cut from infrastructure spending in impoverished areas, and in exchange, there's only about 50 billion given in social grants, and I've already explained how poorly these have been handled and paid out. New money injected into the economy, I can't read my own thing, is only 30 billion, or under one, I think under 1% of GDP. Reprioritization of existing government spending within this austerity framework is not really a fiscal stimulus. So government has really not come to the party in any genuine sense of the word. Okay, some consequences of all this. And this happens to be a picture of three ladies carrying firewood on their heads, which they walk a couple of kilometers down the road to fetch on an almost daily basis. So this is social welfare in South Africa, women fetching firewood. So the inadequate measures of government have negatively affected business, but particularly the large informal sector and the existing and newly unemployed. GDP is expected to contract by at least 7.1% this year. I've got these from World Bank figures. This is the deepest contraction in a century and 8% lower than they previously were forecasting. Faster growth is likely to be constrained by fiscal tightening, and there are likely, if the economy starts to move again, to be persistent power supply disruptions, which South Africa was suffering for the last few years because of the semi-collapse of the electricity supply system and repair to the national grid. And if COVID-19 sort of lockdown restrictions persist, it's going to make things even worse, and the recession will be even deeper. And just to look at unemployment, I'm getting to the end of this. The numbers that are available at the moment capture what you could say is the crisis, before the COVID-19 crisis, but don't yet fully capture the devastating impact of lockdown. So there are about 10.8 million unemployed, which is an increase of about 400,000 during the first quarter. And since 2008, since December 2008, which obviously reflected the last world economic crisis, it's up by 4.9 million people. Unemployment rate, this is the expanded rate. It's not the rate that the government likes to give. They like to give a so-called narrow rate of unemployment. 44% for Black Africans, females 48%. In the Eastern Cape, where I am, which is one of the more underdeveloped parts of the country, 49%. And in some parts of the Eastern Cape, you find up to about 80% unemployment. And certainly after COVID, unemployment will be over 50%. And you have to ask, is a society really viable anymore when 50% of people are unemployed? And just to look at the kind of situation we're facing in public health at the moment, which was supposed to have a breathing space to sort itself out, the Eastern Cape is a particularly bad example. Although the crisis started in the Western Cape, where COVID hit first, the system has collapsed in this province. at the most basic level, there's not enough oxygen for everyone. So people in hospital are literally fighting each other for oxygen cylinders. There are not enough hands to care for everyone. Medical staff are ill. Nobody can get into the hospital, so there are no witnesses to what's actually going on. And doctors fear being fired for speaking out. Nothing was done about promises to make more personnel available. Promised extra PPE has not been supplied. And we've got an emergency field hospital, which I think is supposed to cater for about 1,000 people, that they haven't been able to find any staff for it. That was partly funded by Volkswagen, which is based at Uitenhage near Port Elizabeth. In Port Elizabeth, which has got a population of 967,000, there are only 2 ambulances running at the moment. And our COVID-19 cases are likely to double in the next 10 days. By Friday night, we had nearly 22,000 cases and 371 deaths. That's in the Eastern Cape. Estimates are we're going to have 441,000 cases by the middle of next month and over 1,000 deaths. But we can't really give the right kind of care. And the spokesperson for the Eastern Cape Health Department was quoted in the local press as saying he hadn't been made aware of these issues. So you could sum up by saying that government's support measures have been a disastrous failure. We need urgent action to support livelihoods, to keep people from starving, to advance people's rights, to sustain businesses, and prevent economic and social collapse. But the old fiscally conservative line that was put forward in the budget before COVID hit continues. So ultimately, we're likely to see continued economic stagnation and decline, further reinforcement of our enclave economy, in other words, pockets of wealth, pockets of socially exclusive areas in the middle of a sea of poverty, and inevitably more repression. I mean, only today there have been horrific pieces of video from the Western Cape of people being evicted from their shacks, a naked man being chased around by the police and beaten. So we're not improving on our PR either. So you could ask, what level of disaster will it take for government to change their policies? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for a quite depressing
sorry
these things. So could you stop the sharing as well, Russell? So
yeah, I'm trying to work out how to do that. But technically challenged out here in the sticks. I'm sorry. Let me just.
Right. Okay. I think I've done it actually. So that's
You've
great.
done it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Right. Thank you. Thank you again. If for nothing else, making the British government look competent. Depressing stuff. Anyway, so anyway, over to you for your thoughts and questions. Jagdish has had his hand up for quite a while, so over to you, Jagdish. Could you unmute yourself? Sorry.
Yeah. Hi, Russell. It's been 40 years since we were down in the streets of East London, so I haven't seen you for a long time. Look like you haven't aged at all. How are you keeping? All right? Looks like there's no light in the background there, Russell. You must be in a pretty tough circumstances there. I just wanted to ask a couple of basic stuff, Russell. In a couple of your slides, you mentioned more kind of recently the number of deaths as being something like 1,040 or something. But much earlier on, you were saying that there's prediction of 48,000 people dying. I don't know whether I've misread the numbers on your slides. If you could explain that. And one of the things that is a little bit controversial here is that the number of Black and minority ethnic people who are dying compared to white people. Have you got any idea about what the figures or breakdown is like? in South Africa in terms of blacks, whites versus coloreds and so on? Or is there more stark breakdown between, say, rich and poor and so on, or age profiles? If you got any thoughts on that, that'd be really good.
Okay, great. Jenny? Again, you have to unmute yourself, sorry.
Right.
Right.
Is that me?
Yep.
Well, that was depressing beyond belief. You know, from a country that's the second largest, I think is the largest economy in Africa, it paints a pretty gruesome picture. I think, I suppose, really the thing that Russell left out was to what extent the government are taking any kind of responsibility, to what extent there's any accountability for this disaster and previous disasters. And of course, that raises the question of what, if any, opposition or coordinated action there might be, you know, to express opposition to it all. It's so catastrophic. You kind of are left wondering, is there any way out of this? Because clearly there's been very ineffectual opposition all along, and anyway, perhaps Russell could expand a little bit on political reaction and political accountability here. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, exactly my question as well. James Woodhausen.
Well,
James,
yeah, I have. Connectedly, how long has Ramaphosa got, would you say, given what may vulgarly and has been described as, you know, the approach to Zimbabwe in South Africa? It might not have all the features of Zimbabwe, like high inflation and so on, but the problem, as far as I can see, is that Julius Malema and his sort of radical Stalinist opposition to Ramaphosa and the ANC is not going to bring any positive results, quite obviously. I think some of the inspiration behind Rhodes Must Fall in England. So it does look very bleak, and what the chat is saying, what Jenny's saying, what we're all hoping for, given the, you know, the heroism that South Africa represented for us in England, you know, 20, 30 years ago. Is there any chance of anything good coming out of all of this, or you know, must we hope for the Chinese again to ride in like the cavalry? Are they doing that just yet?
Okay, great. Phil Mullen, again, unmute yourself.
Thanks. Yes, thanks, Russell, for that, as everyone said, rather grim portrayal. Two questions. The discussion, as Rob sort of alluded to, you know, we're clearly having a discussion in Britain that's been a pretty, or appears a pretty shambolic, incompetent governmental running of the pandemic. And there's a discussion about to what extent is that a policy problem, to what extent is that a delivery problem. And I wonder if that's something which has any bearing in terms of what's happening in South Africa. I mean, people talk about the, you know, if you look at the international institutions, they just say there is a non-functioning state. And so when you look at your slides and you compare this, you know, quite extensive list of policy decisions that seem to have been made, and then the abject failure of them to be followed through, you know, how do you see it in terms of, you know, the responsibility of the political leadership, and, you know, are they not really sincere about these things, or is it just a, you know, a fact that there isn't a state apparatus to implement even what, you know, some of the politicians might want to do with you know, good intentions? And the second question is, you stress right at the end, just, you know, what would it take to overcome the fiscal conservatism? And that does seem quite distinctive sort of response, because almost everywhere else, the big theme is government is back, and it's been something that's been building up, since the financial crash, that government does have to, for pragmatic reasons, play more of a role in the economy. We've seen it with central banks, obviously, in quantitative easing and so on in many Western countries, Western regions, and yet you see that the government in South Africa seems to be stuck on its austerity program, and therefore doesn't want to even acknowledge that the state maybe have to play a bigger role in terms of even propping up this extremely weak economy. So is there no sense in which that discussion is taking place of South Africa perhaps following? I'm not saying it's a solution to the problems of the South African economy and politics, but is there no way that the government is picking up on that sort of rehabilitation of state intervention in the rest of the industrialized world?
Okay, I'm going to take David, and then I'm going to give Russell a chance to come back and make some points, and then I'll come back out again. So Russell. Oh, sorry, I'll unmute you. There you go.
Okay. You want me to? You said David.
Yeah, if you just come back on whatever you want.
Okay.
I mean,
yeah, I'm sorry. It's been a bit grim. Maybe it's just my vantage point in the Eastern Cape. But I mean, the last few days have seen the discussion of just the total collapse of the health system, and it seems to be unraveling now in other parts of the country. On Jagdish's question, I think there is an assumption it's going to be about 48,000 deaths by November. Whether those are reliable statistics, I don't know. And his question is an interesting one about so-called BAME deaths. The economic freedom fighters, who are probably the most vocal opposition, noisy opposition anyway, have specifically been complaining that government has failed to give a breakdown of infections and deaths by ethnic grouping. So it's very difficult to know. But I think we can fairly safely assume that poor people, poorly fed and poorly housed people are going to be the ones that are suffering the worst from this situation. Whether our patterns follow the sort of Western or northern patterns of older people, like in care homes, etc., dying, I think is not absolutely clear. But I mean, we have a large number of people with all sorts of morbid health conditions in this country: high blood pressure, tuberculosis, HIV, AIDS, and I think we can assume to some extent that at least some of those conditions, particularly the high blood pressure, the kidney failure kind of situation that a lot of unhealthy people are in, are going to lead to a lot of deaths in that kind of sector. And those are going to be poor people and poorly housed working class people. Is there any opposition to this? Well, I mean, the official opposition, the Democratic Alliance, is Helen Zille, the noisiest sort of leader in that alliance, has been using diversionary tactics and going on about how there are more racial laws under this regime than there were under apartheid. So that's diverted entirely from real questions of what is to be done in this current situation. Although the one DA province, which is the Western Cape, is probably better run and has got better health measures to deal with COVID-19. But as they were the first and had the most deaths early on, they got a lot of stick for that. But as far as coordinated opposition goes, the left initially, what you could call the left, the old left, initially sort of put together a campaign to try and get government to modify its policies on social welfare, quantitative easing, generally break away from fiscal conservatism. A lot of documents were written. attempts were made to feed this into government channels, but it seems to have pretty much gone nowhere. And we have a fairly moribund opposition in this country, like everywhere else, I suppose. So there's no coherent political opposition. Or, I mean, the biggest thing you hear is about the need to stay at home, keep safe, etc., etc. As with everywhere else, there's a lot of fear in the air around this, and no sort of political alternatives on offer. How long does Cyril have? Ironically, Cyril comes out looking much better than anybody else, as far as I can tell. I think his popularity still exceeds any other leader. Most of other leadership has come across in a fairly discredited way. The opposition has not been looking good. So yes, it's bleak. The Chinese, will they be coming in? I mean, there is talk of a recent major deal, Chinese taking over large tracts of land for mineral extraction, but I don't know that there's any obvious Chinese intervention at the moment. I think China has assisted with some PPE, etc. But I think Cyril remains pretty much unchallenged. Cyril Ramaphosa, I'm talking about, the existing president. And to most people, sounds like the voice of reason. Although a lot of old ANC loyalists are very angry with the current situation and very embittered, but don't really have any answers. And to move on to the questions that Phil asked, it's a long-standing issue. We have allegedly good policy, but inability to implement. I think so much of the state bureaucracy has been about what you could crudely call a process of primitive accumulation, that we've had an eating away of capacity in the state bureaucracy, and people who actually are interested in being capable deliverers of services tend to take a back seat and tend to be sidelined. So is the leadership sincere? It's difficult to say. I mean, the president himself is one of the wealthiest men in the country, and was part of the original black empowerment process, you know, of old political activists bought into the existing business arrangements in the country. So sincerity, it's a good question. Why there's this fiscal conservatism? It's a very good question. National Treasury, I think, has been used since 1994 as a way of trying to bring a bit of sanity into the way government is run through fiscal measures. And I think that remains. This fiscal conservatism is the only handle that those political managers with any amount of sense of direction have got to try and keep government in line. So fiscal conservatism is almost the key political lever to try and run a government on a rational basis in South Africa. But I think this is something that needs more discussion. I know the left, if you can call it that, was pushing the whole quantitative easing thing, was arguing against the fiscal conservatism that's been traditional, but that's had, as we can see from the figures I gave you, budgetary figures, had virtually no impact.
Okay,
I can't really answer your question, Phil.
Okay, that was great. So I'm going to whiz around. We're actually slightly overrunning already, but never mind. It's all been very, very interesting. So I'm going to come to David. If you could unmute yourself. And then far away.
Okay, so I want to take a different view than Russell has taken and pose something to him. There's no pandemic in South Africa, it's all rubbish. Let's just look at the numbers. The total confirmed numbers of cases in South Africa today are 150,000. 150,000. The deaths in the country are 2,600. That's not a pandemic. there's no overwhelming of the hospitals. It's just simply untrue. There's a proposition being put forward, Russell's reflecting the conventional view, that is widely challenged by numbers of other people. And those are the figures. So Russell defends why this is a pandemic and the hospitals are being overrun. I think the more interesting question is, with these low numbers, extraordinarily low numbers, for a society of the size that we are in South Africa, 60 million people and those numbers, why have we closed down the economy? It's absolutely bizarre. The consequences, of course, are faced by the poor. That's always the case. Second thing I want to say to you, and I can't really give you great detail for this, but here's a proposition. The reason why people are dying in the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape, first the Eastern Cape. That's where the elderly are. That's traditionally where the elderly always are, for working class people. And in the Western Cape, same thing. Large numbers of elderly people. Look across the breadth of South Africa elsewhere, you don't see these numbers. So this fits very much with the pattern that we see on an international basis. Is it not encouraging that working class people treat the conventional proposition with utter contempt? You go through any of the working class areas, and I do that. You go through Soweto. People have long stopped social distancing, masks, in Yeovil, stopped it, broadly stopped it, have no respect for it whatsoever. Next question for you, Russell. Do you not think it's very attractive that the taxi industry is saying to government, we don't care about how much money you've got. We need money. Our members need money. You give it to us. And if you don't give it to us, we'll break the law and we'll do what we want to do. Isn't that something that's extraordinarily positive about a working class response? Is that we're not interested in how you meet your economic desires. We have desires, we have needs, and our needs are our priority, and your rules are irrelevant to us when it comes to our needs. I think that that's an absolutely terrific response that we see in the taxi industry, and incidentally, we see it elsewhere within this economy. So broadly, I want to say to you that there are some very encouraging responses in the South African working class. Doesn't want to take responsibility for this stuff, wants to get what it needs, wants its jobs, and to some extent, and I know I haven't really subjected this to very close analysis, but I also differ with you about how the South African government is going about this. Sure, they're inefficient, but they're reaching everywhere they can to find money to deal with the problem that they face, both with business and with the needs of the working class, and they're prepared to borrow anywhere to do it. So again, government under pressure will do what it needs to do.
Right, okay, thank you very much. Daniel.
Okay, well, maybe just first of all on the first point just made by David on the casualty figures. I mean, it's quite right. If you look at the Johns Hopkins University figures, they collate the figures internationally. The number of deaths at the moment is 2,600, which is quite low relative to South Africa's population of what, about 60 million, something like that. But I'd be very, very cautious about just taking those figures at face value. First of all, because there could be a lot of undercounting. But more importantly, we're still in the early stages of the pandemic. You know, especially someone like South Africa, you can't put the same model on it as you would looking at Britain or Germany or the US. It's not just about the elderly. You know, in South Africa, as Russell talked about in his introduction, you have millions and millions of immunocompromised people. You know, people with HIV, tuberculosis, and so on. And those people are very, very vulnerable, even though they might be 20, 25, 30 years old. So we can't be sure what would happen, but it seems to me that there's a real potential for the medical side of the pandemic to get a lot worse. I mean, it's already spreading from, as far as I can see, from the Western Cape, and it's now becoming much bigger in Gauteng and Pretoria, Johannesburg, and so on. So it could, I don't know for sure, but I think the casualty figures could rapidly increase. They could get a lot worse. I'm conscious I'm being as gloomy as Russell, but I think that is the real situation. At least there's a strong possibility that could happen. It's not just picked out of nowhere. The main point I wanted to make, though, or question really, is I do find it very difficult to understand South Africa in many ways, because it's not a poor country. I mean, there are obviously many millions of poor people in South Africa, and that's a big problem. But in aggregate, it's classified as a middle-income country. It's got a lot of natural resources, as Russell referred to in his introduction. So potentially, at least, you would think that it has got resources that it could use to help mitigate the effects of the pandemic and to help grow the economy. But even before the pandemic, the economy seemed to be in a real mess. You know, this is a real long-standing problem of a lack of growth. So stagnant growth in some respects, like Italy, just, you know, it's not growing. But unlike Italy, a rising population, so income per head is falling quite significantly. So I mean, people have referred to things like the delivery problem and the fiscal conservatism, but isn't there more to it? Why can't it get the economy off the ground? I think that's a really interesting and important question. And then finally, I don't really understand the lockdown either, because it doesn't seem to me to be likely to be effective in containing the pandemic. I mean, when you do have people in these informal settlements, you know, the slums in South Africa, in townships, where they can't socially distance, where in many cases they don't have access to water in their own home, it seems to me that lockdown is a strategy, as I said in an earlier forum, where in places like South Africa, where it has a huge amount of economic damage, but at the same time, there isn't really a benefit in containing the pandemic. I just can't see the benefit. It seems to be a very strange kind of strategy.
Okay, right. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. James Woodhousen.
Well, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing you right. Nomzamo Ngwabi has raised the question of state capture. And I remember Jacob Zuma, you know, being involved in this case with the Indian squillionaires, the Gupta brothers. And I was always very suspicious of the idea that the private sector had captured the South African state. That seems to me what, say, critics of Big Pharma say, and I don't buy it. If you look at pharma, for example, just to digress, it's all run by the state. The whole thing is state regulated, FDA approved, and so on. So I always felt that the South African state was actually the dominant partner, despite the Gupta corruption media furore. And I want to ask Russell and also maybe David, you know, where has that debate got to? And is the disintegration of the state to do with embedded Zuma-style corruption? Although I don't think that corruption explains much of what's going on in Africa. But you know, since you mentioned, Russell, the kind of inability of the state to implement its measures, it seems to me it's a kind of sort of squillionaire, guardian, Stalinist bureaucracy on the loose. And, you know, I can't think of anything worse. I mean, the Guardian's bad enough. But, you know, it seems to me that the historic tradition of the ANC, which is Stalinism, has, you know, really more than ever, not just the shanty towns and everything, destroyed the working class movement and destroyed independent politics and now the healthcare system and the economy. And this was we should not forget in Britain that the ANC was the cause célèbre, along with Mandela, for many, many years. And that's why we don't hear all the things that you're telling us, Russell, because Ramaphosa still gets a clean bit of health as the non-corrupt version of Zuma.
Right, great. Okay, I'm going to take in Robert Figg, and then I'll come back to Russell to closing remarks. Really, we're massively over time. But anyway, Robert.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of points about what's happened during the pandemic on the commodity side, because South Africa, of course, is one of the world's largest gold producers and one of the world's largest consumers of oil. In the first case, in gold terms, the price of gold is practically at an all-time high, and we've seen significantly low prices on oil, and those have been fairly beneficial to the South African economy during the pandemic. The problem we've had is that China, which is South Africa's effectively largest trading partner in commodities, stopped buying many of the commodities that South African produces, vanadium, ferrochrome, manganese, and gold, platinum, palladium, and various other commodities because of the massive decline in demand. That, of course, with the recovery in China to where the purchasing managers index is now well into the 50s, 60s%, China is now buying South African resources again. China is a very big customer of South Africa. Recently, we saw, just before the pandemic broke, we saw Russia, the Russian Navy, the Chinese Navy, and the South African Navy doing joint exercises off Cape Town. We see large numbers of Chinese industries moving into South Africa and cheap loans coming in. The problems that they're facing are fairly large. I mean, I think from an industrial perspective, the lack of power and the failure of the state-run enterprise Eskom to provide power to industry has been a major brake on the economy for some time. And secondly, the mining charter, which is a very poor attempt at resource nationalism, has scared off a large number of investors from the South African economy over the last few years. So it's in a very difficult position at the moment. The markets are recovering in the commodities that South Africa is very strong at. It should be fairly beneficial to the economy over the next few years. Obviously, the power issue has to be resolved.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much for that insight there. Right. Russell, do not attempt to cover all of that, I think. Just pick out maybe 2 or 3 points to the central ones to come back on. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Rob. Well, all I can say is I hope David is right. We don't know really at the moment, but what we do know is hospitals in the Eastern Cape are overwhelmed. And I'm not just getting that from the media, but from people in the medical profession that I know. People with COVID-19 are lying in beds or in corridors next to other casualty cases in the hospitals. The hospital's overflowing. I mean, I don't know, maybe the press is exaggerating, but it's got to the stage where people are sort of dying in the street because they can't get treatment for COVID-19. And it's a reality that this big 1,000-bed hospital that VW paid for has not got any staff. And there's a union problem as well. I mean, unions have refused to cooperate because they say there's no PPE. I agree with David. The economy was probably closed at the wrong time, too early. When very little was going on in the way of infection. I mean, it's been argued that we've got such low infections because we closed so early, but I think now is the time where you'd want to see a proper strict closing down of things, and that happened 3 months ago. So people are not going along with it anymore. But for David also to say that people are treating the whole thing with contempt, that's not true whatsoever. Certainly not where I am. Maybe it is in Joburg. There's intense fear of what's going on. People do wear masks, even in rural areas. And I don't know whether the taxi rebellion is really such a positive thing. Taxi operators are not regarded as a particularly progressive bunch by most South Africans. In fact, are held in quite a lot of scorn for the kind of criminal way they run their operations. So whether that's an encouraging thing, I don't know. The working class movement as an organized movement is pretty much dead in this whole situation. David talks about encouraging working class responses. I'm not quite sure what those are. workers have been pretty well sidelined in all this and are suffering enormously as a result of closures of industry and closures of businesses. Around here, most workers lost their jobs for several months because there's no tourism industry and it's hardly got going yet. Yeah, I think Daniel's points were fairly common sense. You know, we don't know yet, but it seems that it is getting worse. It started off in the Western Cape, and it's now taking off in the major areas, particularly in Gauteng. And it's a bit of an unknown at the moment. James makes the points about corruption and the Guptas and the dominant role of the state. Well, I think state capacity has declined since 1994, and the approach that was taken as part of the settlement to incorporate the old leadership of the National Liberation Movement into business in a subsidiary relationship, I think has been followed through. But capacity of the new state, which is where the ANC is dominant, has not grown, except its capacity really to utilize state machinery for self-enrichment or empowerment, as people call it. There is a kind of Stalinist ethos in this whole thing, for sure. As you can see in the measures that have been implemented in COVID-19, where a former Minister of Health in Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma uses her current role as Minister of Local Government to enforce all sorts of irrational health measures, such as the ban on alcohol and cigarettes, which have no particular scientific basis, but there's this kind of authoritarian orientation of the political elite, similar with the Minister of Police. I think Rob made some useful points about commodities. How long it'll take before the commodity sector in South Africa starts to recover is another question. But you'll notice that the mines were never totally closed, even under the most stringent stage of lockdown. So what the old left used to call the minerals energy complex remains pretty significant in South Africa. But I don't know how long it's going to take for the economy to recover here. I don't think we yet know how much key sectors of the economy have suffered from being almost totally closed down. As I said before, I hope David is right and that we are an exceptional case in the world and we're not going to have major deaths thanks to COVID-19, but I don't think we have the information yet to say whether that's true or not. What we do know for sure in this part of the world is the health service has totally imploded.
Okay. If you would like to unmute yourselves and give our speakers a round of applause, because they're quite a fascinating double bill. You'll have to unmute yourselves. I'm sorry, I can't mute you. Anyway, that was not a very well organised round of applause, but nonetheless, thank you both for your comments today. It's been really, really enlightening. Just to close, the next Economy Forum is going to be on next Tuesday, and it's something entirely different, which is we have Matt Ridley, who's the well-known science writer and who has got a new book out called How Innovation Works, which he describes as one of the most important yet least understood processes in terms of the economy. And it's got lots. It's a very, very readable book if you get a chance to read it before next Tuesday. But he will be introducing his own book, and then we'll be grilling him about it. So that'll be at 7 o'clock next Tuesday. Until then, thank you very much for coming along. It's been a really, really good discussion, and have a good evening.